What happens when talent meets prejudice? Meet Melanie Graham, an 11-year-old prodigy dismissed by everyone around her. Will her music be enough to shatter their biases, or will their silence speak louder than words? The Grand Music Conservatory classroom was a place where time seemed to stand still. High ceilings stretched upward, their ornate moldings catching the afternoon light that spilled through tall windows. Polished wooden floors gleamed underfoot, and the faint scent of aged wood and polished brass lingered in the air. At the far end of the room sat an old piano, its keys yellowed with age, as if it had witnessed decades of practice, performances, and whispered dreams. Melanie Graham sat at the very back of the room, her navy blue blazer slightly too big for her small frame. Her white blouse was neatly pressed, but the cuffs were frayed, betraying years of careful mending. She clutched her violin case tightly against her chest, her knuckles pale. It wasn't much, just a second-hand instrument with scuffed edges, but it was hers. Every scratch on its surface told a story of late-night practices, stolen moments, and quiet determination. Professor Romeo stood at the front of the room, his silver hair perfectly combed, his tailored suit immaculate. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on his sharp nose as he surveyed the class with an expression somewhere between disdain and boredom. He tapped his baton against the lectern, drawing the students' attention. "Today," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we discussed the upcoming additions for the youth orchestra." A murmur rippled through the room. The orchestra was the pinnacle of achievement at the conservatory, a prestigious ensemble reserved for the most talented students. Melanie felt her heart quicken. She had dreamed of this moment for years, though she had never dared to speak of it aloud. "The audition process will be rigorous," Professor Romeo continued, pacing slowly. "Only the best will make the cut. This is not a space for amateurs or those who lack dedication." His gaze swept over the room, lingering briefly on Leonard, the golden boy of the class, before moving dismissively past Melanie. When the professor paused, Melanie hesitated for only a moment before raising her hand. The movement was tentative, almost shy, but it carried a quiet resolve. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, Professor Romeo's lips curled into a condescending smile. "Yes, Miss Graham?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Do you have something to contribute?" Melanie's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "I'd like to audition," she said, her voice soft but steady. The room erupted into laughter. Some students snickered openly. Others exchanged smirks. Even Leonard, seated near the front, turned to glance at her with barely concealed amusement. Professor Romeo chuckled, shaking his head. "This isn't a playground, Miss Graham. Stick to your scales." The words hit Melanie like a slap. She lowered her hand, her face burning, but she refused to look away. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. She could feel the weight of the other students' stares, their whispers carving invisible lines into her skin. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred. Anger. Quiet, simmering anger. They didn't know her. They didn't know the hours she spent practicing in secret, the nights she played until her fingers bled. They didn't know about Harriet Laurent, the rebellious eldest daughter of the wealthy family her mother worked for, who had taken Melanie under her wing and taught her techniques far beyond what anyone here imagined. As the class moved on, Melanie's mind drifted to those memories. She remembered sneaking into the Laurent mansion after her mother finished cleaning, finding Harriet waiting for her in the music room. Harriet would toss her a knowing grin, saying, "Let's show them what we're made of, kid." Together, they'd play duets, their music filling the empty halls with life. Harriet had always believed in her. Now, sitting in this cold, judgmental room, Melanie felt the absence of that belief keenly. Harriet had left for college weeks ago without so much as a goodbye, leaving Melanie to navigate the complexities of Storm in D minor, a piece Harriet had composed specifically for her. Without Harriet's guidance, every note felt heavier, more elusive. After class, Melanie lingered behind, pretending to pack up her things while the other students filed out. She overheard Professor Romeo speaking with another teacher near the door. "She'll squeak out Twinkle Twinkle if she auditions," Romeo said, his voice low but laced with derision. "Mark my words." The other teacher laughed. "Poor thing doesn't stand a chance." Melanie froze, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. Her cheeks flushed hot again. But this time, it wasn't shame. It was defiance. They thought they knew her. They thought they could define her limits. She zipped up her violin case and slung it over her shoulder. As she walked out of the classroom, she caught sight of herself in the mirror-like reflection of the polished floor. Her dark eyes burned with a newfound intensity. They were wrong. She would audition. Not because they thought she should, but because she wanted to prove to herself that she could. The days that followed Professor Romeo's announcement felt heavier than usual. Melanie trudged through the conservatory hallways, her violin case slung over one shoulder, her thoughts tangled like knots. Each step seemed to echo louder in the vast, empty corridors, as if the building itself were mocking her. Harriet's absence loomed large, a void she couldn't fill no matter how hard she tried. Without Harriet's guidance, Storm in D minor felt less like music and more like a labyrinth of frustration. Melanie sat alone in the practice room after hours, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead casting a sterile glow on the sheet music spread across the stand. Her fingers hovered uncertainly over the strings of her violin, trembling slightly before they made contact. She drew the bow across the strings, but the sound was jagged, uneven, nothing like the fluid melody Harriet had once coaxed from her. Frustration bubbled up inside her, sharp and bitter. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to summon the memory of Harriet's voice. "Breathe into it, Mel," Harriet would say, her tone firm yet encouraging. "Let the music come from here." Harriet always pressed a hand to her own chest when she said it, as if reminding Melanie that the heart mattered as much as the hands. But now there was only silence. No Harriet leaning against the piano, no teasing grin or gentle corrections. Just Melanie, staring at the notes on the page as if willing them to rearrange themselves into something she could understand. At school, things weren't any easier. Leonard, the golden boy favored by Professor Romeo, took every opportunity to remind Melanie of her place. He sauntered past her locker one morning, his polished leather shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His violin case gleamed under the light, a brand new model, sleek and expensive, and he held it casually, as though its value meant nothing to him. "Hey, Graham," he called out, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw attention from nearby students. "Does your mom polish instruments too? Or do you just borrow hers?" A ripple of laughter spread through the group clustered around him. Melanie clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't respond, simply turned her back and walked away, but the sting lingered. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they landed, finding cracks in her armor that she hadn't even known existed. Later that day, during ensemble rehearsal, Leonard leaned back in his chair, smirking as he watched Melanie struggle with a passage. When Professor Romeo signaled for a break, Leonard raised his hand lazily. "Sir," he began, his tone dripping with false innocence, "I think we should let Melanie audition, for charity." The comment earned another round of snickers from the other students. Melanie kept her gaze fixed on her sheet music, refusing to give him the satisfaction of looking up. But she could feel Professor Romeo's eyes on her, heavy and disapproving. "Very well," Romeo said finally, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Miss Graham, since Mr. Hayes has so graciously volunteered you, I suppose we must allow it. Let's see what the janitor's kid can do." The room erupted in laughter again, but this time, Melanie didn't flinch. Instead, she felt something shift within her, a spark igniting deep in her chest. They thought this was a joke, a spectacle. Fine, let them laugh. Let them underestimate her. After class, Melanie retreated to the basement of the conservatory, a forgotten space rarely used by anyone except the maintenance staff, including her father. The air was cooler down here, tinged with the faint smell of damp concrete and old wood. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as if caught in an invisible breeze. She set up her music stand and opened her case, taking out her violin with deliberate care. Her fingers brushed against the worn surface of the instrument, tracing the scratches and dents that marked its history. This violin had been with her through everything: the late-night practices in the Loron mansion, the whispered lessons with Harriet, the quiet moments when she played just for herself. For hours, she practiced, her movements becoming more fluid with each repetition. Her fingers ached, blistered from pressing too hard on the strings, but she barely noticed. Every mistake fueled her determination. Every correct note felt like a small victory. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she collapsed onto the cold floor, her violin resting beside her. That's how her father found her later that night, curled up in the dim light, her breath slow and steady. He knelt beside her, gently shaking her awake. "Melanie," he said softly, his voice rough with concern. "What are you doing down here?" She blinked up at him, groggy but resolute. "Practicing," she murmured, sitting up slowly. Her father sighed, running a hand over his face. "You can't change their minds with talent alone, sweetheart. Sometimes people don't want to see what's right in front of them." "I'm not doing it for them," Melanie replied, her voice firmer now. "I'm doing it for me." Her father studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, standing up and offering her his hand. "All right then. Just promise me you won't let them break you." "I won't," she said, taking his hand and pulling herself to her feet. As she packed up her violin, she noticed an envelope tucked into the corner of her case. Puzzled, she opened it and pulled out a letter written in Harriet's unmistakable scrawl. "Dear Mel, I know I left without saying goodbye, and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to keep playing, not because someone tells you to, but because it's yours. Play like you're the only one who matters. And remember, storms don't last forever. Love, Harriet." Melanie folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. That night, as she practiced alone in the basement, she began to experiment with the piece Harriet had composed for her. She wove fragments of a traditional African folk melody into the structure, letting the rhythm guide her bow. The result was something raw and powerful, a fusion of classical precision and emotional depth. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was hers. The basement of the conservatory became Melanie's sanctuary. It was a place where time seemed to stretch and bend, where the world above, the laughter, the whispers, the judgment, faded into a distant hum. Each night after classes ended, she descended the creaking staircase, her violin case clutched tightly in one hand. The bulb overhead flickered occasionally, casting shadows that danced across the cracked concrete walls. But none of it mattered. Here, she was free to be herself, to pour everything she had into her music without fear of scrutiny. Melanie set up her music stand beneath the swaying light, the sheet music for Storm in D minor spread open before her. She adjusted the angle slightly, ensuring every note was visible. Her fingers hovered over the strings of her violin, trembling not from uncertainty but from anticipation. This was her battleground, her proving ground, and tonight she intended to fight harder than ever. She began slowly, deliberately, working through the piece measure by measure. Every note was a challenge, every phrase a puzzle waiting to be solved. When her bow stumbled or her intonation faltered, she didn't stop. Instead, she rewound mentally, dissecting the mistake until she understood its root cause. Then she tried again and again until the sound emerged clean and true. Hours passed unnoticed. Her fingers grew raw, blistered from pressing too hard against the steel strings. The calluses on her fingertips split, leaving faint smears of blood on the neck of the violin. Still, she played on. Pain was temporary. Mastery was eternal. As the night wore on, she found herself drawn back to Harriet's letter, tucked safely inside her pocket. "Play like you're the only one who matters." Those words echoed in her mind, guiding her movements as surely as the notes on the page. She closed her eyes and let the melody take shape, as something new, something uniquely hers. The African folk melody her grandfather had taught her years ago began to weave itself into the composition. At first, it was subtle, a single phrase here, a rhythmic motif there. But as Melanie experimented, The two styles merged seamlessly, creating a hybrid that felt both familiar and revolutionary. The classical foundation remained intact, but now it carried an undercurrent of defiance, of resilience. It was no longer just a piece of music, it was a declaration of identity. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Melanie made a decision. She would finish modifying Storm in D minor, infusing it with every ounce of passion and defiance she possessed. By the time the audition arrived, the piece would no longer belong solely to Harriet. It would belong to her. And when she played it, they would hear more than just notes. They would hear her story. The next morning, Melanie arrived at school earlier than usual, slipping into an empty practice room before classes began. She unpacked her violin and positioned herself in front of the mirror, studying her reflection critically. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, but her eyes burned with purpose. She started playing, letting the music flow through her like a river breaking free from its banks. The African melody surged forth, bold and unapologetic, intertwining with the classical motifs in a way that felt both chaotic and harmonious. It wasn't perfect yet. There were moments when the transitions faltered, when the rhythm wavered, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling behind it. By the time she finished, sweat beaded on her forehead, and her arms trembled from exertion. But she felt alive in a way she hadn't in weeks. As she packed up her violin, she caught sight of Leonard lingering outside the door, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the glass. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Melanie alone with her thoughts. She didn't know what he had heard or what he thought of it, but it didn't matter. This journey wasn't about him. It never had been. With renewed determination, Melanie headed to class, her steps steady and sure. Whatever came next, she was ready. The day of the audition arrived, cloaked in a tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls of the conservatory. Melanie stood backstage, her violin case resting at her feet, her hands clasped tightly together. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and nervous sweat, mingling with the distant hum of tuning instruments. Through the heavy velvet curtains, she could hear murmurs from the audience. Students, teachers, and even a few parents who had come to witness the selection process. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reverberating like a drum roll. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. Harriet's words echoed in her mind. "Play like you're the only one who matters." It was easier said than done when the weight of so many expectations and prejudices hung in the balance. Still, she clung to the mantra, letting it anchor her amidst the chaos. Professor Romeo's voice cut through the din, his tone clipped and formal as he addressed the assembled crowd. "Welcome to the auditions for this year's youth orchestra. Each student will perform a piece of their choosing, after which they will receive feedback from our esteemed panel." Melanie glanced down at her sheet music, though she barely needed it anymore. Every note of Storm in D minor was etched into her memory, not just as sound but as feeling, as defiance, as identity, as survival. She adjusted the strap of her violin case over her shoulder, her fingers brushing against the worn surface. This instrument had carried her through countless late nights and moments of doubt. Today it would carry her onto the stage. When her name was called, the room fell eerily silent. She stepped forward, the spotlight blinding as she made her way to the center of the stage. The whispers rippled through the audience like waves, some curious, others dismissive. Leonard sat near the front, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. As Melanie positioned herself, he leaned back in his chair, feigning a cough into his hand. "Trash!" he muttered loud enough for those around him to hear. A few students snickered, but Melanie refused to acknowledge them. Instead, she focused on the podium where Professor Romeo stood, his expression unreadable behind his wire-rimmed glasses. She raised her violin to her chin, her bow poised above the strings. For a moment, everything else faded. The whispers, the judgmental stares, the weight of expectation. All that remained was the music. The first notes rang out, sharp and clear, slicing through the silence like a blade. The opening bars of Storm in D minor were intricate, demanding precision and control. Melanie's fingers danced across the strings, her movements fluid and confident. Each note was deliberate, imbued with the hours of practice that had brought her here. Then came the African folk melody, woven seamlessly into the composition. Its rhythm pulsed with life, raw and unapologetic, transforming the classical structure into something entirely new. Melanie poured herself into the performance, her body swaying slightly as the music surged forward. Her bow moved with urgency, coaxing sounds from the violin that felt almost primal. A cry, a plea, a declaration. The audience was spellbound. Even those who had doubted her, Leonard included, sat frozen, their expressions shifting from skepticism to awe. The headmistress, seated beside Professor Romeo, leaned forward in her chair, her eyes wide with admiration. As the piece reached its climax, the folk melody crescendoed, filling the hall with a haunting beauty that left no room for indifference. Melanie's bow pressed harder against the strings, drawing out a final, searing note that hung in the air long after she lowered her instrument. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the room, building into a crescendo of its own. Students rose to their feet, clapping fervently, their earlier mockery forgotten. Professor Romeo gripped the edge of his podium, his knuckles white. He opened his mouth to speak, his usual condescending critique already forming on his tongue. But before he could utter a word, the headmistress interjected, her voice firm and commanding. "That, Professor," she said, cutting him off mid-sentence, "is artistry." The words hung in the air, silencing any attempt Romeo might have made to diminish what had just transpired. His face flushed red, but he said nothing, simply nodding curtly before stepping aside. Melanie stood motionless under the spotlight, her chest rising and falling with the effort of what she had just accomplished. She scanned the room, taking in the standing ovation, the stunned faces, the grudging respect, even from Leonard, who stared at his shoes, unable to meet her gaze. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the music. What mattered was the truth she had poured into every note. As she walked off stage, her father appeared in the wings, his eyes glistening with pride. Without a word, he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if afraid she might disappear. "You did it, Mel," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed them who you are." Melanie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything. The music had spoken for her. Backstage, the other students avoided her gaze or offered tentative smiles, unsure how to reconcile the girl they had dismissed with the musician who had just silenced an entire auditorium. Melanie ignored them, focusing instead on packing up her violin. She paused for a moment, glancing at the photograph of Harriet tucked into her case. Though Harriet wasn't there to see it, Melanie knew she had been listening. In the echoes of the melody, in the rhythm of the strings, in the quiet defiance that had carried her through. As she zipped up her case and turned to leave, Melanie felt lighter, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally lifted. The journey wasn't over, but she had proven enough, for herself, for Harriet, for everyone who had ever doubted her. The days following the audition passed in a blur of whispers and stolen glances. Melanie moved through the conservatory hallways with her usual quiet determination, but now there was something different about the way people looked at her. Some students nodded respectfully as she passed. Others avoided her gaze altogether, their earlier mockery replaced by an awkward silence. Even Professor Romeo seemed to shrink into himself during lessons, his critiques softer, less pointed when directed at her. Melanie earned first chair in the youth orchestra, a position no one could dispute after her performance, but she refused to gloat. Instead, she carried herself with the same humility that had always defined her, letting her music speak for itself. Still, she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in the atmosphere around her. The weight of expectation lingered, heavier now that she had proven herself capable of meeting it. One afternoon, as she packed up her violin after rehearsal, Leonard approached her hesitantly. His usual arrogance was absent, replaced by an almost boyish uncertainty. He cleared his throat, shuffling his feet awkwardly before speaking. "Hey, Melanie," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "I wanted to ask you something." Melanie turned to face him, her expression guarded. She didn't say anything, simply waited for him to continue. "I've been working on my bowing technique," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "And I was wondering if you'd be willing to give me some pointers." For a moment, Melanie considered refusing. It would have been easy to dismiss him, to let his earlier cruelty go unanswered. But as she studied his face, she saw something unexpected: vulnerability. He wasn't the golden boy favored by Professor Romeo anymore. He was just another student, struggling like everyone else. Finally, she nodded, her gesture small but firm. "All right," she said simply, turning back to her case and zipping it shut. Leonard exhaled, relief washing over his features. "Thanks," he murmured, offering a tentative smile before walking away. Weeks later, Melanie returned to the Loron mansion on a crisp winter evening. The house was alive with the sounds of holiday preparations, carolers practicing in the parlor, the clinking of glasses as servers arranged trays of hors d'oeuvres. Harriet had come home from college for winter break, and tonight was the first time they would see each other since her departure. Melanie made her way to the music room, her violin case slung over one shoulder. The grand piano sat in the corner, its lid raised as if waiting for someone to play. Harriet stood near the window, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of string lights strung along the edges of the glass. When she heard Melanie enter, she turned, her face breaking into a wide grin. "Mel!" she exclaimed, rushing forward to pull her into a tight hug. "You were incredible at the audition. I heard all about it." Melanie smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "You left without saying goodbye," she said quietly, her voice tinged with reproach. Harriet's smile faltered, guilt shadowing her expression. "I know," she admitted, stepping back slightly. "And I'm sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing, giving you space to figure things out on your own. But I should have stayed in touch." Melanie nodded, accepting the apology without needing to hear more. They had never needed many words between them. Their bond ran deeper than language. "Play it for me," Harriet urged, gesturing toward Melanie's violin. "The piece you performed at the audition. I want to hear it." Melanie hesitated for only a moment before unpacking her instrument. She positioned herself in the center of the room, the familiar weight of the violin resting against her chin. As she drew the bow across the strings, the melody filled the space once again. Haunting, powerful, defiant. Harriet listened intently, her eyes shining with pride. When the final note faded into silence, she crossed the room and placed a hand on Melanie's shoulder. "Now they see you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Melanie lowered her violin, meeting Harriet's gaze. "Do you think so?" she asked, her tone uncertain. "I know so," Harriet replied firmly. "You didn't just prove yourself to them, Mel. You proved yourself to you. That's what matters." From the doorway, Melanie's mother watched silently, her eyes brimming with tears. She had spent years cleaning houses, enduring condescension and invisibility, all while dreaming of a better life for her daughter. Now, standing in this opulent room, watching Melanie play a piece that blended tradition and innovation, she felt a surge of pride so profound it nearly overwhelmed her. As the music echoed through the halls of the Loron mansion, it carried with it more than just sound. It carried resilience, identity, and triumph, a testament to the power of defiance and the courage to embrace one's true self. When Melanie finally set down her violin, she glanced at her mother, who offered a watery smile and a nod of approval. The journey wasn't perfect, nor was it finished. But as the echoes of her music lingered in the air, Melanie knew one thing for certain. She had found her voice, and no one could take that away from her. This story makes us reflect on the courage it takes to defy expectations and embrace our true selves. What would you do if the world told you no, but your heart said yes? Comment below. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that challenge and inspire.